All right, so sometimes the story breaks and you just got to be like, wait a minute, what did I just hear?
Oh,
That's
yeah.
kind of where I'm at with this whole thing about the Trump administration and classified info.
Mm.
We're going to dig into this story about how war plans for strikes against the Houthis in Yemen got out,
Oh, yeah.
apparently by accident.
Oh,
The source for this is The Atlantic, and the thing that really got me was how this info supposedly got out there, saying it was through a Signal group chat.
oh, wow.
Yeah. So we're talking about Mike Waltz, J.D. Vance, even Jeffrey Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, was supposedly added to this chat by mistake.
Really?
It's just wild.
Yeah.
So today we're going to deep dive into this whole thing and try to figure out, what does it mean when classified war plans are being talked about on a private messaging app? And how does this stack up against all the scrutiny we've seen in the past when other folks have been accused of mishandling sensitive government info?
Yeah, it really makes you think about how vulnerable this type of information is when it's outside those official government channels.
Right, exactly. So let's get into the nitty-gritty here. According to what The Atlantic is reporting, classified war plans for strikes against those Houthis in Yemen were being talked about in this Signal group chat,
Uh-huh.
and Jeffrey Goldberg ending up in the chat totally by accident. That kind of points to maybe not being as careful as they should have been about who had access to this information.
Yeah.
It seems like the chat even had details about when these strikes were planned and what they were going to target.
Mm.
And get this, J.D. Vance apparently even brought up in the chat whether this whole thing lined up with what Trump was saying about Europe at the time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it's like, even within the group, there were questions about if this was the right move or if it went against what they were trying to do with Europe. Makes you think.
Definitely shows they knew it might not have been so straightforward, or that it maybe didn't fit with the bigger picture.
Now, let's talk about the reactions to this story, because they've been pretty interesting. When Trump was asked about it, first thing he did was just dismiss The Atlantic.
Oh.
Called him failing, and then he immediately switched gears and started talking about how successful the strike was.
Hey.
Basically dodging the whole question about how risky it was to be discussing war plans on an app like Signal.
Classic move. Change the subject to something that makes you look good.
Totally. Then there's this other person who shows up in the reports as Hexeth. I guess that's how they're saying the name.
Yeah.
And their reaction is described as full-on panic. They reportedly just went off on Jeffrey Goldberg, calling him all sorts of names like deceitful, discredited so-called journalists.
Wow.
Yeah, and then they tried to totally change the subject, start talking about how successful the Houthi campaign's been, and even something about deferred maintenance during the Trump administration.
Wow.
There's even this part where this Hexeth person seems to mix up Jeffrey Goldberg's name and why he's asking questions in the first place. It's just bizarre.
It seems like they were trying so hard to discredit the journalist that they weren't even really dealing with the actual story.
Exactly. And then this Hexeth person says something that just stuck out. They said, quote, "Nobody was texting war plans," unquote.
Oh.
I mean, come on. It's like that whole "I did not have sexual relations with that woman" kind of thing.
Yeah, when you come out with a denial that strong, it just makes people wonder.
Then we got Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, chiming in. He's trying to downplay the whole thing,
Okay.
saying how precise and successful the military mission was. But by saying that, he basically admitted that classified info was being talked about,
Oops.
which is the whole point everyone's worried about.
Who kind of shot himself in the foot there?
Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because this whole story brings up a lot of questions about hypocrisy and double standards. You remember all the heat that Hillary Clinton took over using a private email server for government stuff?
Oh, yeah. For years.
Right? People were losing their minds talking about national security risks and all that.
The big worry was that foreign governments could get their hands on the information, or that it would compromise intelligence sources and methods.
And people were saying if anyone else did this, they'd be in jail. It was a huge deal.
Yeah.
And, Pete Buttigieg even brought up the scenario of what if someone accidentally added someone from a foreign government to this Signal chat?
Oh, wow.
And Amy McGrath was criticizing these officials, saying they were being reckless, especially since there were reports that someone in that chat had just been to Moscow.
Oh, man.
Then you got Hillary Clinton herself, and she's like, what is going on?
Right.
After everything she went through, it's got to be pretty surreal to see this happening.
The thing is, the info that was supposedly being talked about on Signal actual war plans,
Yeah.
that's arguably way more sensitive than a lot of the stuff that was in those emails.
And don't forget, this is the same Donald Trump who was going on and on about how important it is to protect classified information.
Uh-huh.
He was using words like extreme carelessness and premeditated misconduct when he talked about Clinton's emails. It's kind of hard to square that with how he's reacting to this Signal thing.
It really makes you wonder if the rules are different depending on who you are.
Now, there is a different take on this coming from a Trump supporter named Joey Manorino. He's calling this whole thing a deliberate media strategy.
Oh, right.
He's saying it's all 5D chess. The idea is that there's no way people in these positions could make a mistake like accidentally adding a journalist to a chat where they're talking about top secret stuff.
That's a pretty bold claim.
It is. The sources we looked at are pretty skeptical about what Trump would even gain from doing something like this.
Yeah, I mean, leaking war plans on purpose seems like a pretty big risk.
But regardless of whether it was intentional or not, the bottom line is that really sensitive information got out to people who weren't supposed to have it.
Yeah, you can debate about the why all day long.
Yeah.
But the what is still pretty concerning.
So here's what we got. Classified war plans being talked about on a private messaging app with the Atlantic's editor accidentally listening in. The reactions have been all over the place, from flat-out denials to trying to make it seem less important by focusing on the success of the mission.
And this whole thing is happening against the backdrop of how much scrutiny other people have faced for handling government info in different ways.
Right. It just seems like there's a huge disconnect between how the Trump administration talked about classified information in the past and what's happening now.
Absolutely.
So I'm left wondering, and maybe you are too, what does this all mean? How are we supposed to think about national security and the way sensitive information is being handled at the highest levels of government?
Yeah.
It makes you question who you can trust. And if anyone's really being held accountable when these kinds of things happen, that's a lot to think about.
Definitely a lot to unpack there.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's definitely a story that's going to keep developing, so make sure to stay tuned. We'll keep you updated as we learn more.
See you next time.
Bye.